Welcome ladies and gentlemen, this is Mon, and in this guide, we'll go over Silent Anabasis, the best Frost Vortex weapon in oncehuman. Now before starting with an overview of its weapon features, comment down below which weapon guide you'd like to see next. Starting with the weapon features, 15% chance to trigger Frost Vortex upon a bullet hit, and Frost Vortex is a dot area of effect of elemental / status damage of 30% psi intensity, dealing damage once per second for 4 seconds. Up to 2 Frost Vortex spawned by you can exist at the same time by default. This damage is of Frost element, it cannot crit, cannot strike weak spots, and will not decay with distance. Now coming back to the weapon features, hitting a target generates an Ice Crystal, which has a cooldown of 1.5 seconds. Ice Crystals also automatically shatter after 15 seconds, dealing Frost elemental status damage equal to 100% of your psi intensity in an area. However, you're going to want to shatter them yourself by shooting them, since that'll increase the damage they deal to 350% psi intensity. And lastly, Frost elemental damage plus 30%, with an additional 8% for every ice crystal shattered, which lasts for 15 seconds and can stack up to 3 times. So from these weapon features, it should be pretty clear that this weapon is a heavily elemental oriented weapon. So for blueprint stars, armor blueprint stars are what's going to matter for this weapon's damage, since armor blueprint stars give psi intensity, and this weapon scales off of that mostly. Now there is a very important tip that I'd like to go over, and that's going to be the usage of improved portable MG turrets with the Phantasm perk. So the Phantasm perk is a mimetic specialization perk that you unlock from level 20 to 35. And essentially what it does is, if we take a look at my turret, you'll see that the portable MG turret mirrors the attributes and effects of the weapon currently held by the player. So this essentially means that if I have a turret down and it's shooting at the enemy that I want to shoot at, it's going to mimic my Anabasis effect, which essentially will allow the turret to spawn crystals. And so if you use those turrets, it's going to help you by a lot against enemies that are tankier, such as Light Dreamers or Nightmare level bosses if you're soloing them. I do believe that if you're in a Anabasis server, the name isn't Phantasm, it's something else that I forgot, so if you do know, let me know in the comments, but yeah. If you can, then try to use those Phantasm turrets, they greatly benefit the Anabasis. Moving on to your weapon calibration, the preferred calibration that you're going to want to run will be Heavy Style. This will increase your magazine capacity by a lot, which will make Anabasis very comfortable to use. If you use Rapid Shot Style, sure, you might spawn Frost Vortex slightly earlier, but per mag, you're only going to spawn like 1 to 2 crystals before you need to reload. So you're pretty much going to constantly be reloading if you use Rapid Shot Style, and so that'll in turn make Heavy Style much better. As for the calibration substats, this weapon is an elemental weapon, so you're going to want to use double elemental substats. Moving on to the accessories, I'm running a stability setup, so that's going to be the hammer compensator, the compact reflex sight, the tactical combine grip, and the extended rifle mag. As for the ammo that you're going to want to use, the best ammo to use are going to be disintegrating AP ammo, suppression AP ammo, and penetration AP ammo. If you're clearing silos, then you're going to want to use suppression and penetration, depending on the type of enemy that you're fighting. However, if you're clearing overworld mobs, or if you're doing monoliths, then you're going to want to use disintegrating AP ammo. The simple reason for this is because suppression and penetration ammo do not work when you're fighting mobs in the overworld or when you're doing monoliths. However, if you cannot craft any of these 3 ammo, then of course the baseline best ammo is going to be tungsten AP ammo. Moving on to your secondary and melee weapon, starting with your secondary, that's going to be the Bingo. or the bullseye depending on which UI you are looking at the weapon. If you're looking at via the weapon blueprints, it'll say that it's bullseye, but after you've crafted it, it'll say that it's a bingo. But the reason for this is because the bingo can apply the bullseye effect, which is 8% vulnerability for 12 seconds. So 8% more damage to all of your damage sources for 12 seconds. And also, after you switch to this weapon, the first hit with bingo is guaranteed to proc the bullseye. So we're really using bingo for how easy it is to apply the bullseye effect. I know it gives weak spot damage and attack bonus, however those buffs don't really matter for Anabasis, which is pretty much a pure elemental weapon. Then, for your melee weapon, it's going to be the Kukri, because when you defeat an enemy with a heavy strike, you'll gain 20% Psi intensity, which will increase your Anabasis elemental damage, so it's Frost Vortex and it's crystal damage. And how do you make it so you get this buff easily? You're going to want to get the Ice Pot Deviation, which will craft you sticky ice crystals. And essentially what you just do is, well actually let me just show it to you first. My Psi intensity here is at 170. What you do with the ice crystals is you just throw them on the ground, you hold your melee button to deal a heavy strike, and if I take a look at my Psi intensity, I'm currently sitting at 1256, which is a 20% increase from 1070 Psi intensity. Now, one extra thing I want to go over is the first weapon feature, which is defeating a target grants all weapons attack plus 30% and crit rate plus 15% for 10 seconds. You'll trigger this the same way that you trigger the Psi intensity buff with the Ice Cube, obviously, but here I don't want to focus about the crit rate since Anabasis doesn't really care about crit rate. What I want to focus on is the attack plus 30%. Now you might think this is an increase to your attack multiplier right here. So for instance, if I hold my gun, you see that it's an increase to this. You might think it is, but it's not. What makes the Kukri so strong is that this is not just an attack increase, this is a 30% increase to all of your weapons multipliers. So here, just to show it to you guys, I'm going to stack the weapons feature to 3 stacks so that I get the elemental damage bonus to its max value, since if you remember, the last weapon feature of this weapon is 8% elemental damage with each crystal that you shatter. So I'm going to stack this up, and here you'll see that my crystals at max stack deal 752 damage. So if I use the Kukri here, I'm just going to, okay, well, the Kukri just destroys itself. And this one just has a weird spawn. I destroy this, and you'll see that right now, my crystals are shattering for 1,173 damage. So let's just math this out real quick. My Psi intensity was at 150. I had 71.8% frost elemental damage. If I shatter the crystal myself, I deal 350 Psi intensity. And do keep in mind that the Psi intensity here is with the 20% Psi intensity buff. So the 30% attack increase isn't an attack increase to your bullet damage, it's a multiplier increase to all of your damage sources. And here, just to math it out, with the Kukri, I was dealing 1,173 damage, which corresponds to my Psi intensity, which was 150, which is 125 times 1.2, times 3.5, which is the 350% Psi intensity scaling of the ice crystals. This 1.718 is my elemental damage, and times the 1.3, which would correspond to the supposedly 30% multiplier increase from Kukri, which here confirms that, well, it is an actual 30% increase to all of my multipliers, not just to my attack, since obviously these two numbers match. So pretty much this just proves that this is not the attack buff. Moreover, just to show it even more, if I just proc the Kukri buff, currently I'm sitting at 336 attack. I proc the Kukri buff, I take a look at my stats, you'll see that my attack number did not increase. Moving on to your deviation, you have 2 choices to pick from. You have the Snow Sprite, and you also have the Polar Jelly. Of course, if you're going to use one or the other, try to go for their special variant. So for the Polar Jelly, this is going to be the Starfall Inversion one, which grants extra elemental damage. And if you use the Snow Sprite, try to look for one that has the Lunar Oracle effect, which grants extra status damage. But of course, do keep in mind that skill rating is still the most important part. Now, as for the one that you're going to want to pick, usually I would just recommend using Lunar Snow Sprite or just the Snow Sprite, just because that it can spawn ice crystals near the designated target that you wanted to spawn ice crystals on, and these ice crystals, by the way, deal more damage than the ones that you spawn yourself. And not just that, it'll also increase the frost damage that enemy receive by 48%. So pretty much the Snow Sprite can be used anywhere, so it's really convenient. Whereas with the polar jelly, the problem with it is that you either have to be like on top of the enemy. So for instance, like here, right, this, I just spawned it right next to the enemy. Here, for some reason, it just flies over the wall. Just a bug that happens sometimes, I guess, when I do this at my base and there's a wall. But this is the first way that you have to use it. Otherwise, you have to put it in the frost slash mode. Let me just refill the energy. You have to put it in the frost slash mode, and then you have to throw it at the enemy. I don't know why my thing is bugged right now. Right here. So you just throw it at the enemy, and then it'll do its stuff and its damage. However, obviously, the problem with this is that if the enemy moves around a lot, then the polar jelly literally is useless. But essentially what the polar jelly does is that it will increase the frost damage received by surrounding targets by 36%, which is slightly less than what the snow sprite can do. However, that is compounded by the fact that it will also deal a lot of personal damage itself. It'll pull enemies towards itself, and not just that, when you spawn Frost Vortex inside of the jelly's radius, it'll create additional ice spikes. But usually I just stick with Lunar Sprite just because of how convenient it is to use. However, I have to say that in select content where enemies don't move at all, such as Light Dreamers, I do find the clear speeds to be slightly faster with the jelly. Moving on to your key gear, you have essentially two options. You have the Snow Camo Gloves, and you also have the Stealth Walker Wrap, which by the way, for this key gear, it changes name once you craft it. But starting with the usual one that you would want to run, which is the one that's going to increase your damage by the most amount, is going to be the Snow Camo Gloves. This essentially makes it so that every time your ice crystal shatters, it'll create 4 additional ice missiles, which will launch at the nearest enemy, which will each deal 50% psi intensity to its target hit, so for a total of 200% psi intensity. So pretty much the Snow Camo Gloves are the key gear that you're going to usually want to run if you just want more damage. However, there's also a place for you to run Stealth Walker Wrap. So if you want to run a support build where you would pull enemies, because this is what the Stealth Walker does, it makes it so that your Frost Vortex will pull enemies towards the center of your, well, Frost Vortex. So essentially you'd run this if you want to run a support build, but this also has an important place once we get the Lunar Visional Wheel back. Because what the Stealth Walker Wrap was able to do is that, let's say you were fighting a Lunar Spawn, you just shoot at it, spawn a Frost Vortex with the Stealth Walker Wrap, and the Lunar Spawn would not be able to shoot back at you. So this was incredibly strong for that. Now, instead of picking Snow Camo Gloves, you might also wonder if you should run Earthly Boots, because it gives 30% damage against X-type enemies, which is the strongest multiplier you could have. However, as comparison between both key gear, the Earthly Boots are not going to perform better than the Snow Camo Gloves. Though do keep in mind that sometimes if you do the dummy tests, the Snow Camo Gloves won't spawn the ice missiles on your dummies if they're, like, for instance, too close to a wall like this. Like right now I'm running the Snow Camo Gloves, I'm just going to spawn 1 ice crystal, and you'll see that it doesn't spawn the ice missile. So just keep in mind for that if you really want to test it yourself. But here, for instance, if there's not a wall, I just shoot, spawn a crystal, I shoot here, and you'll see that it spawns the missile. So just, make sure that when you do your dummy tests, don't do them near a wall. If you wish to see more oncehuman guides or content, then do consider liking this video, subscribing to my channel, and turning on the bell for future video notifications. Now there are 3 possible gear set combinations, starting with the strongest overall. This will be the low HP preset, and that's going to be 3 treacherous tides pieces and 2 shelter or 2 blackstone pieces. The 3 treacherous tides pieces will give you a permanent 50% weapon and 50% status damage bonus as long as you have low HP, so lower than 70%, and your sanity is low as well. Now, ideally, you're going to put your sanity at 0%, which corresponds to a max HP reduction of 60%. And how do you do this? Well, you're going to want to do it by eating a plethora of food items, so you could use spoiled food. However, if you are a chef, I would really recommend crafting the special large boiled water that gives you minus sanity, which you can do by simply going to the advanced stove or stove, whatever you have. You go into the creative cooking section. You just put like 1 water normal, like purified water or boiled water, it doesn't matter. And then you put 5 dirty water. And just like that, you'll get sanity decreasing water, which can go all the way down to minus 1000 sanity per large boiled water. The best part about this is that it will also not inflict the gastric discomfort effect, which pretty much makes you lose all of your weight and some other stuff. Now, as for the 2 shelter pieces and 2 blackstone pieces, I personally prefer shelter because it's a permanent 8% elemental damage. However, should a fight last really long, then you could consider blackstone since the problem with blackstone is that you have to stack it up. But if you do stack it up, you will keep the buff at 10% elemental damage bonus as long as you deal elemental damage every 2 seconds. Now, if you are in a Way of Winter server where the temperature can be very high or very low, then you're definitely going to want to consider 4-piece Blackstone and the 1 piece of your choice between Lone Wolf or Renegade. So for the 4-piece Blackstone, the reason for this is because you're not going to want to craft it with Starter Source. You're going to want to either craft it with Hot Rock Ore or Cold Crystal Ore. This is what you're going to want to run in a Way of Winter server because this preset can give you up to 60% elemental damage bonus. So pretty much you get 10% from this, then you get a 40% from this, and you get an extra 10% from the cold status. However, do keep in mind, you will have to play around with the Way of Winter items that the Way of Winter scenario can give you that can change your temperature. But essentially, if you craft it with cold crystal ore, you're going to have low temperature, but if you craft with hot crystal ore, then you're going to need high temperature for the buff to get to 60%. However, if you're not going to go with the previous 2 combinations, so if you want to go with the high HP preset, which by the way the Blackstone preset is also a high HP preset, it's just that you can only use it in a Way of Winter scenario. But here for the general high HP preset, then you're going to want to run 4-piece Shelter and 1-piece Renegade or 1-piece Lone Wolf. The 4-piece Shelter can give you up to 38% elemental damage bonus, and the Renegade will give you extra reload speed, or if you go with Lone Wolf, it'll give you a few more ammo per mag. Of course, there's also the variation where you run it slightly riskier, so you use 3 Shelter pieces and then you use 2 Savior pieces, but you know, it'll really depend on yourself and if you're comfortable with having your effects linked to having your HP being above 70%. Since obviously Savior is pretty great, as long as your HP is above 70%, the 2-piece effect will give you a permanent weapon and status damage bonus of 10%. Moving on to your mask hide, the best mask hide to use is going to be Lucky Rabbit Fur. The reason for this is because it gives 10% elemental damage, and usually you have less elemental damage than status damage, so elemental damage is going to be stronger. Now here I do know it says after scoring a crit hit, you'll gain 10% elemental damage, but really it's not a crit hit, it's just any hit. So I have currently a Lone Wolf mask with the Lucky Rabbit Fur effect, and no Cradle perks except for Deviant Energy Defense, which is just the shield so that my screen doesn't become bright red for you guys. And here I currently have 52.8% elemental damage bonus. If I just shoot at this dummy, you see that this was not a crit hit. However, if you take a look at my stats, you'll see that I'm at 62.8% elemental damage, which is 10% more than 52.8. So the Lucky Rabbit Fur does work even if you don't do a crit hit. Moving on to your Cradle perks, I'm currently in a non-novice scenario, so I'll go over those Cradle perks. If you're in a novice scenario, you will have different Cradle perks unfortunately. But for mine, I'm going to go with Anti-Void for the rifle damage bonus and for the damage bonus against Void anomalies. You're also going to want to go with Status Enhancement for the status damage bonus, Elemental Sense, and Extreme Freezing for the Frost Vortex keyword damage bonuses. Then you're still left with 4 choices. You're going to want Deviant Energy Defense for the shield, which is very important, especially if you're playing low HP preset. Then you'll also want Aerial Suppression and Tactical Leap, both for the damage bonus against any type of enemy in the game, and also for the damage bonus against any type of enemy in the game, and for the 10% damage bonus against their shields. Though here, I will say that this damage bonus is only applied to certain type of content, so most often it's only going to be active when you're doing silos. Now I know that for Tactical Leap it says that it's about 20% damage against deviants, and Aerial Suppression is damage received from monsters, but I'll show you in a second that it's not just against monsters and deviants. But now with the last choice, usually I just go for a tactical combo to just squeeze out some more weapon damage, but if you don't really care about it, you could also go with something like Rapid Aid so that you use your activators faster. Now, just to show you that Aerial Suppression is damage received from monsters minus 30%, I'm just going to jump and then I'll take a look at my stats and you'll see that here I have 30% damage reduction against Deviants, Rosetta, and Vultures. Then as for Tactical Leap, I have to trigger it for at least 1 second. So I'm just gonna, well, there are other ways to trigger it, but I'm just gonna trigger it just by jumping over a ledge and then using my V. So here I have 3 seconds of the buff. If I take a look at my stat sheet, you'll see that I have 20% damage bonus against Deviants, Rosetta's, Vultures, and 10% damage bonus against Deviants, Rosetta's, Vultures, Shield. Moving on to your food buffs, starting with the food slot. If you are bossing, so you're killing bosses, enemies that spawn a big HP bar on your screen, and you're not a chef, then you're going to want to prioritize Mixed Fried Hot Dog for the 20% damage bonus against marked enemies, which here, by the way, counts as damage bonus against bosses, or just damage bonus against X type, which is going to be the strongest multiplier because you usually have the least amount of it. Not just that, but it'll also buff both your weapon damage and your elemental damage, which I guess, albeit bullet damage isn't a lot of what this weapon's damage is, it'll still buff it. However, if you are a chef, then as your secondary slot, you're going to want to go with bone-in deviated sausage, and the reason for this is because it's the same thing, it's damage against bosses plus 15%, only that this one scales lower, but you won't need to mark the enemy, unlike with Mixed Fried Hot Dog, where you do gain more damage bonuses, but you have to mark. Now, if you're fighting Light Dreamers in Endless Dreams, then you're going to want to swap Bone and Deviated Sausage for Roulette Dumplings and try to roll for the damage plus 15% against elite enemies. This is literally the same thing as Bone and Deviated Sausage, only that Bone and Deviated Sausage is for bosses and Roulette Dumplings, you can get it against elites. Now, if you're wondering how to get Roulette Dumplings, you just simply press Escape, you go to your Events, Visional Wheel, Starfall Collection, you go on Past Shop, and here you can use your Gravity Crystals to buy the recipe for Roulette Dumplings. Not just that, but this is where you also get Lunar Suffix mods. Now, there is also the option for Canned Minty Meat, which is 15% frost damage bonus, but this unfortunately is not keyword frost damage bonus. This is only elemental damage bonus. So you will literally be better set if you just use something like Layered Galaxy, which is straight up 30% elemental damage bonus. Then for your drinks buff, if you're not a chef, then you're going to want to focus on Whimsical Drink for the status damage bonus that it can give. However, if you are a chef, then you're going to want to usually consider Stardust Energy Drink, which gives you the ability to double jump, which will help you trigger Tactical Leaps effect, which is, just as a reminder, for every 1 second spent airborne, you'll gain 20% damage against any type of enemy in silos. Moving on to your mods, suffix, and substats priority, starting with the weapon mod and the mask mod, you're going to ideally go for Frost Vortex suffix mods, and the reason for this is because they give Frost Vortex keyword damage bonus, which is a stat line that you have less compared to elemental damage bonus, so this is going to be more important. Then as linked attribute, you're going to look for frost damage bonus, which here will count as elemental damage, and as general attribute, you're going to want to look for 2 damage bonuses against X type of enemy, with your rolls focusing into the main type of enemy that you want to have the damage bonuses for. If you're fighting Great Ones, you're going to want damage against Great Ones, but if you're fighting elite enemies, such as Light Dreamers, you're going to want damage against elite enemies. And here what I like to do is I have a preset for each type of enemy in the game, so normal enemies, elite enemies, and Great Ones. Then moving on to your helmet and your top mods, if you do not have lunar suffix mods, you're going to want to go with talent suffix mods, but if you do, then you're going to want to go for elemental damage bonus, status damage bonus, and 1 type of damage bonus against X type of enemy. And the reason why we want to go with lunar suffix is simply because they scale much higher than your talent suffix mods, even when you're at around 70% HP. Now, if you're wondering, but I can't get lunar mods, well, you actually can, unless if you're playing in an Endless Dream server, but essentially what you do is you go to Shop, you go to Event, you go to Visional Wheel, Starfall Collection, you click on Past Shop, and here with your Gravity Crystals that you farm in a Visional Wheel scenario, you can buy lunar suffix mods. Then for your pants mod and your boots mod, if you do not have downstar suffix mods, you'll still go with talent suffix mods, but if you do have downstar suffix mods, then you're again going to want to go with elemental damage, status damage, and 1 damage bonus against X type of enemy as general attribute. And lastly, for your gloves mod, you're just going to want to go with talent suffix with status damage bonus as linked attribute, and 2 damage bonuses against X type of enemy. Moving on to your mods, starting with the Silent Anabasis mod, the preferred mod to run, which will give you the most amount of damage, is going to be Vortex Multiplier. This will allow you to have 1 more Frost Vortex to exist on the map, and the mod will also give you 10% Frost Vortex keyword damage bonus. There's also some other options, but personally I think they're not really that worth to run. Frosty Blessing is just a minor heal option, which, I mean, I don't really need the heal most of the time, so it doesn't really matter. Then there's also Cryoblast, which makes it so that Frost Vortex gives 4% vulnerability to the enemy, and will also reduce your movement speed by 10%, but you don't really need that since it's only 4% vulnerability, which in my opinion doesn't matter that much, and albeit sure it reduces movement speed, but usually if you care about the movement speed, you'd just be running Covert Walker Shirt, which will pull the enemies into Frost Vortex. Then there's also Shattering Ice, which is when an enemy at the center of the Frost Vortex is defeated. It'll deal 1 instance of ice damage of 50% psi intensity to enemies within 1 meters, but you know, it's only 50% psi intensity, which by the way is the amount of damage of a single missile, which albeit it'll deal damage to all of the enemies within 1 meter, it's only 1 meter and it's only 50%, so in my opinion, it's not really worth to run it. Then for your secondary weapons mod, you're going to want to go with Vulnerability Amplifier, which will add an extra 8% vulnerability to the already existing 8%, so it's a free damage bonus. Then for your helmet mod, you're going to ideally go with Deviation Expert. It'll reduce your range by 25%, which doesn't really matter that much because that only modifies your bullet damage, but it'll give you 10% fire rate, which will help you spawn Frost Vortex faster, and it'll also give you 20% status damage bonus. Now you could use Work of Proficiency as well if you lack elemental damage, since what Work of Proficiency gives is 20% elemental damage and a 10% reload speed bonus when you reload with an empty magazine. However, this can be slightly more annoying to use, but you also have to use a trick if you want to get the buff on your first mag. So just to show it to you guys, I currently have no Cradle perks except the Deviant Energy Defense Cradle Shield. If I take a look at my stats, I'm sitting at 63.8% elemental damage bonus, and here I also have the, this is Deviation Expert, let me just swap it real quick, and here if I take a look at my stats, you'll see that my gun just unholstered, you'll see that I am sitting at 63.8% elemental damage bonus, and here I have Work of Proficiency that's not active yet. So the trick, essentially what you do, is you just hold your reload button, and for me it's R, so you just swap ammo. This will force your gun to reload at 0 bullets. If you want to use, still use the same bullet, you just come back to the same one. Essentially, you just swap, you come back to the same one, and you'll see that here, if I take a look at my stats sheet, I'm actually going to sit at 83.8% elemental damage bonus without having to shoot a single bullet. So this is the trick that you're going to want to do if you want to start your magazine with 20% elemental damage bonus. The cool thing about this mod is that if you just swap your weapon out and swap back in, you still don't lose the buff. It'll stay there. It only resets essentially after you reload. Then for your mask mod, you're going to want to go with Frost Construct. This will increase your ice missiles and your ice crystals damage by 10%, and if the target is in a Frost Vortex status, it'll also increase your damage even more. So this is going to be really good, and it's literally made for the Anabasis. You wouldn't really want to run Obliteration because, albeit it gives you Frost Vortex final damage plus 15%, it only applies to your Frost Vortex, and even if it increases its damage for each enemy inside Frost Vortex, this is only a mod that modifies your Frost Vortex damage, and Frost Vortex damage isn't good enough to run this mod on Anabasis. Then for your gloves, you have two options. You have Elemental Overload, which is 18% elemental damage, and you also have Status Enhancement, which is 20% status damage. And here the choice will depend on your own stats, so if you have more status damage than elemental damage, you should run Elemental Overload, but if you have more elemental damage than status damage, then you should run Status Enhancement. Then moving on to your shoe mod, if you're running the low HP preset, you're going to want to run Rush Hour because its effect is every 10% HP loss grants 4% weapon and status damage bonus, which is permanent. So if you're low HP, you will permanently at least have 24% up to 36% depending on how low your HP is. But if you don't run the low HP preset, then you should run Covered Advance since its effect is 20% weapon and status damage bonus for 30 seconds if you don't take damage for 4 seconds. So this is the strongest option out of all of the remaining mods. Then for your top mod, I would recommend you running Quick Comeback, which is when using a healing shot, movement speed plus 20%, which I guess isn't that important, but what it is important is that it'll refill your magazine from the inventory to 100%. Which makes it way more convenient to reload because it takes less time. However, for instance, if your lunar mods are like not on a quick comeback, then sure, you could run the other mod that has the best substats. It's just that I have it on quick comeback, so I'm fine with running it. Then moving on to your pants mod, you're going to want to go with Elemental Resonance, which is for each instance of elemental damage dealt from the previous magazine, the next magazine will gain elemental damage 1% for 15 seconds upon reloading, which can stack up to 24%. This mod isn't really hard to manage compared to all of the other options, such as for instance Precision Charge, which requires you to hit weak spots to gain that elemental damage. You also wouldn't want to run Abnormal Increase because it requires your magazine to be empty, and the status damage bonus that it gives only lasts for 12 seconds, which isn't a long duration, and you're pretty much not going to be able to reach max stacks. Now there's also a very important interaction you should know between Elemental Resonance and Quick Comeback, and it's the fact that when you reload via Quick Comeback, it doesn't actually count as an actual reload for Elemental Resonance, which means your elemental damage buff's timer isn't going to reset. So pretty much if I just demonstrate it here, I'm going to shoot at this dummy, I'm just going to stack up my Elemental Resonance stacks, we'll just stack it up to 24%. So here, I'm currently reloading, you'll see that, well, okay, I didn't deal this much damage, I'm at 15 stacks, whatever. Essentially, if I just, let's say, reload, you'll see that I reloaded. However, if we actually count the seconds, the stacks aren't going to last 15 seconds. As you can see right now, they have already gone away. So what you want to do is the moment you finish your mag, you want to quickly reload with the activator, and then you just start shooting again so that you benefit the most amount of Elemental Resonance buff that you can. But this is it for this guide. If you wish to see more helpful oncehuman content or guides, then do consider liking this video, subscribing to my channel, and turning on that bell for future video notifications. If you have a question, comment down below in the comments. This is Mon, peace out.